All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here and for joining our second plenary of the NACCB, From the Urban to the Wild, Building a Future for Human-Carnivore Coexistence in North America. I'm John Sanderson. I'm just emceeing here to get us kicked off. We have a couple of announcements and then and awards, and then we're going to flip over to the plenary itself. I am the director of the Center for Collaborative Conservation at Colorado State University. I'm speaking here now because I've served on the steering committee for this conference and the scientific program committee, which I've co-chaired with Rebecca McCaffrey, who is going to be moderating this plenary. I want to start with just a very quick statement that I'm sitting in Fort Collins, and that this land that I'm sitting on right now is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. I also want to acknowledge yesterday's plenary, which I think was really remarkable, and what we have heard about the role of people of color and other marginalized groups within conservation, and how that has really been in the forefront of conversations over the past few months, and as well the difficulties that many of us have experienced, particularly people of color, as relates to the COVID-19 pandemic that we're in the midst of right now. So I really appreciate all of you being part of this virtual conference and experimenting with us and learning with us. And through this plenary and on Thursday as well, the plenary I'm moderating, we will weave in some connections to the issues that we spoke about yesterday as well. Lastly, I very much want to thank Megan Kevill, who has done just a remarkable job bringing us all together and making this virtual conference work. The steering committee and the science committee, who's really helped us design these plenary sessions. I'm really excited about this plenary, and I'm going to learn a lot. Before we get started, as I said, just a couple of quick announcements. First up is going to be Dr. Patrick Bixler, who is a professor at the University of Texas in Austin at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. Patrick is particularly interested in how public, private, and nonprofit institutions collaborate to solve complex social and environmental problems. And he's also interested in promoting social innovation. Patrick's also a fellow of the Center for Collaborative Conservation, our fellow alum, our program here at Colorado State University. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Patrick, and he is going to present the Social Science Working Group Award.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks, John. Thanks for the introduction. It's great to be here. So as John mentioned, I'm Patrick Bixler, and I'm a board member of the Social Science Working Group and the chair of the awards committee. On behalf of the working group, I'm proud to present the 2020 Early Career Conservation Award to Kathyun Khalil. Dr. Khalil is a conservation impact manager at the Oregon Zoo and has been at the forefront of advancing more effective use of evaluation to improve conservation outcomes. She's deeply committed to strengthening conservation social science and its application to conservation practice across the globe. Congratulations, Kathyun, and please keep up the great work. And so this is me virtually handing over the award. Thank you, Kathyun.
Thank you very much. This is me virtually receiving the award. Hi, everyone. It is a tremendous honor to receive this award. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon. And while I would have loved to be with everyone at the conference, it is really a remarkable honor still to be able to receive this award. I did my acceptance speech yesterday from the Oregon Zoo, which is where I work and where I first learned to be a conservationist. So profound in its own way. I want to make a few remarks about social sciences and where I see those as playing into the importance of the work that we do. And a lot of that has to do with what we've been talking about with, increased import in the past few months with regard to inclusion and diversity and justice work. And so when I first came into the conservation world. It was very much as a traditional biologist studying lizards in the desert, but I kept coming back to the stories that people would tell me and the things that I would observe them doing and feeling, and questions they were asking when they were out interacting with animals, either in nature or at a zoological facility. And the more I've kind of gotten into this work, the more I see that these diverse perspectives and experiences offer so much insight that we can use to make our programs, our work, our communications, and just the practice of doing conservation more inclusive in every way. And so I am a huge proponent of co-creating approaches to conservation that include a diversity of fields, truly interdisciplinary in our approaches, and love and value the opportunities that I've had and that we will have in the future to integrate social sciences more meaningfully and more intentionally into the conservation work that we do. So thank you so much again. Just such a huge honor, and so grateful to everyone for being a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, and congratulations, Kathleen, and best of luck to you. Well-deserved award, and keep up the great work. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Alicia Siffer, who is a board member of Society for Conservation Biology North America, where she is both secretary and the North American chapter's representative. And Alicia also serves on the SCB Global Board's chapter committee. Alicia is in Cordova, Alaska. I'm very envious for that, where she works at the Prince William Sound Science Center in a new job, studying herring movement in Prince William Sound. Alicia will speak about events for local SCB chapters that are happening during this virtual meeting. Alicia?
Thanks, John. I'm also going to brag a little bit about chapters. So as many of you already know, chapters are a unique part of the Society for Conservation Biology, commonly referred to as our boots on the ground. Chapters are made up of students, professionals, community members who perform conservation projects and education programs at the local level. Chapters work towards the mission and vision of SCB by teaching their local communities about conservation and biodiversity, and perform valuable projects that make a difference to their local flora and fauna. The Society and the North American section are proud to currently support 13 North American chapters and are always happy to hear from groups interested in starting new chapters. Just to highlight a few chapters and their recent activities, the Kingston chapter in Ontario has taught over 25 elementary school classes on topics from recycling to wildlife and native species, organized a campus plastic-free initiative, and hold workshops on making non-plastic alternatives. The Hawaii chapter, which also falls under the Oceania section, supports many of the SCBO conferences, is actively pursuing opportunities to participate in Indigenous-led conservation practices, and is vocal in a local newspaper via a conservation conversation section. That's a mouthful. They will soon host a conservation storytelling event that will emphasize the use of science journalism and documentary film as a means to share conservation messages, change public behavior, and inspire civic action. I could go on, but I'll finish with the Bay Area Conservation Biology Symposium, which is a one-day conference that showcases conservation biology in the California Bay Area and has been running since 1999. It is currently organized by a collaborative effort between the Berkeley, UC Davis, and UC Santa Cruz chapters. In 2019, one of their many events was a Science Through Story workshop that focused on how to generate compelling stories and use visual storytelling to make science appeal to broader audiences. Numerous other chapters hold important events every year that impact their local communities. Participation in chapters brings conservation-oriented persons together and promotes their continued involvement in SCB, particularly within our leadership. Many of us started out in local chapters, and therefore we will continue to support chapters from the section and global society side. In the near future, this support will take the form of small grants for projects, travel, conference attendance, in addition to virtual platforms that allow us to better showcase what our chapters are doing and broaden their impact. At NACCB, numerous chapters will attend a chapter workshop today at noon, and a business meeting that is to be held Thursday at noon. where we will discuss current events and issues that chapters face, especially during the pandemic, and ways to improve the relationship between chapters, sections, working groups, and the global society. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Alicia. And finally, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rebecca McCaffrey, who is a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Geological Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center. Rebecca's living in Missoula now, but she's based and still working a lot in the Olympic National Park in Washington State, where she works with the park itself, local tribes, agencies, and academic biologists on a variety of super interesting projects aimed at conserving, restoring, and monitoring species and ecosystems on the Olympic Peninsula. Like me, Rebecca has served on the steering committee and the science program committee, where she's actually kind of been the chair, and I've been co-chairing to support Rebecca's work. But she's done a really remarkable job helping to put this conference together. And also huge thanks to Rebecca for continuing to step into leadership positions at SCB North America. She is currently president-elect and will be taking over the leadership of SCB North America very soon. This is the last you're going to hear from me. I'm going to tune out for the rest of this plenary. Thank you again all for being here. I am going to be monitoring the questions. So I really encourage you to chime into that Q&A that's on the live stream on the right part of your screen there to ask questions. You can begin asking questions anytime. I'll be keeping track of them, and also feel free to comment, as many folks already have there. So with that, I will tune out and turn it over to Rebecca. Thank you all.
All right, John, thank you for that introduction, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be here for our second plenary. It is really an honor and pleasure to be part of this plenary group. Today, we are going to journey from the urban to the wild. We're going to examine human relationships with carnivores, how carnivores respond to humans, how humans respond to carnivores, and how we can promote and facilitate human-carnivore coexistence into the future. For some, human-carnivore coexistence or conflict might evoke your pet getting nabbed by a coyote in your backyard, or bear getting into your garbage can. For others, it's about finding a balance, or not, between agricultural practices and the presence of large predators on rural and forested landscapes. And for others, coexistence may evoke really vast tracts of wild lands and connected landscapes for the persistence of carnivore populations as far away from human settlements as possible. But of course, carnivore coexistence is all of these things, and that's what we'd like to explore today. I'm going to keep my remarks short. I'm really thrilled to introduce a fresh and diverse set of panelists who are thinking deeply about these issues in a variety of ecosystems, in a variety of contexts. Many are scientists at heart or by training, but their backgrounds and work have them integrating their biological work and their research with social science, cultural norms and history, racial and socioeconomic dynamics, and human behavior. So before I introduce them, I'm going to just really quickly outline how this plenary is going to be structured. I'm going to introduce the four panelists very briefly, but then I'm going to let them do an extended introduction of themselves. And to do this, I will be they will each have about a 5 or 6 minute mini talk where they will talk about their systems and the kinds of questions and ideas that they're thinking about. After that, we're going to move into kind of a guided discussion. We have come up with some topics we'd like to share with you. And after that, we will definitely reserve enough time to take questions from the group. And so the final 20 minutes will be devoted to questions that John will send to me. So make sure that if you have burning questions that you're putting them into the Q&A section, and we'll try to get to as many as we can during that process. So today we have 5 panelists I'm really thrilled about. I'm just going to introduce their names and affiliations at this point, and then let them introduce themselves again through their mini talks. So first, starting on the more urban end of the spectrum, we have Dr. Chris Schell. He should need little introduction if you were at yesterday's plenary, but he'll be switching gears a little bit to talk today about urban carnivores. He's an assistant professor of urban ecology at the University of Washington, Tacoma. Next, we'll move to the urban-wild interface with Dr. Heather Johnson, who's a research ecologist at the USGS Alaska Science Center. And she'll be speaking specifically to work that she did as a wildlife biologist with Colorado Parks and Wildlife in Durango. After that, we'll move into our rural and agricultural landscapes with Seth Wilson, who's the executive director of the Blackfoot Challenge. Following that, we're going to move to our northern neighbors and up into British Columbia. We have two speakers, Kyle Artell, who is affiliated with the University of Victoria and the Rainforest Conservation Foundation. And he will be speaking about the Great Bear Rainforest and conservation work he's involved in there. And finally, Jason Moody, part of the Nuhalk Fisheries and Wildlife Program Coordinator. So I'm now going to pass it over to Chris to kick us off. And just give me a quick second here to do that. Let me turn off my video and get this started.
Awesome. Thank you, Rebecca, for that awesome introduction. And thank you all again for joining for the second day of our NACCB conference. As Rebecca had just introduced, we're going to be talking a lot today about conflict, and I'm going to start with the most urban side of it, thinking about social ecological feedbacks and how they shape human-wildlife conflict and conflict in particular with coyotes and raccoons. So next slide, please. So oftentimes when we're thinking about urbanization, you probably have heard the line that urbanization is rapidly expanding, right? So about 70% or more of the human population is going to be living in urban spaces, and urbanization certainly poses a significant threat to wildlife and biodiversity generally. So thinking about ways in which we mitigate those conflicts, whether it's a biodiversity loss or increasing human-wildlife interactions, is really important as cities continue to expand. Next slide. And as we're thinking about the process of urbanization, it's important to think about how we as humans are essentially the Lin-Manuel Miranda of this particular play. So we are both the directors and the audience. We play all of the roles and we watch the play unfold in and of itself. And that is in essence social ecological dynamics that are magnified within cities. So I understand these very fluidly through these charismatic megafauna, if you will, in coyotes and raccoons. Of course, there are conflicts that expand from everything to, say, food subsidies and different coyotes eating different types of foods, raccoons as well. You see on the bottom left photo, these are a photo of raccoons at a car in Point Defiance Park here in Tacoma. They have become so habituated to getting food from people that they literally wait at cars as if it's a drive-through. And of course, we have different instances like, say, for instance, wildlife vehicle collisions or cats, right? So this is your daily reminder that if you have a cat, keep your cat indoors, or at the very least, have your cat on a leash or create a catio. All of these particular factors can create conflict. Next slide. So understanding conflicts means not just understanding the behavioral biology, the life history, traits, the reproductive biology of the species that we study, but also means understanding all of the feedbacks that go between those animals and society and back and forth and back and forth. The way in which we relate with these animals is dependent on our relationship and thoughts and views, cultural or otherwise, about the animals in the first place. So for instance, much of the work that I do in Tacoma is understanding how people in the city understand coyotes and raccoons. And oftentimes that intersects with whether or not you have an outdoor cat, whether or not you have kids. It also intersects with socioeconomic and demographic factors as well. Folks that live in the richer, wealthier parts of Tacoma tend to dislike coyotes more, whereas those that are in lower socioeconomic statuses tend to not even know that coyotes are in cities. So understanding the processes that shape essentially social heterogeneity, like wealth, like demographics, is key to understanding how we mitigate conflict and interactions inside of cities. Next slide. This is all important because how we interact with wildlife shapes also the evolutionary trajectories of wildlife. So the ways in which these animals adapt to cities is a first signal of this, say, evolutionary trajectory. Then as human wildlife, say, management comes into play, the types of management that we use is a secondary signal that continues to shape the phenotypic and adaptive traits of these organisms. So much of the work that I do is understanding how differences across the landscape, influenced by social heterogeneity, influenced by socioeconomics and demographics, play a role in how these organisms are evolving in cities. Next slide. And the way that I do this, of course, anybody who's studied carnivores knows that you have to be really creative. So much of the work, I was trained as a behavioral ecologist, which means that oftentimes I'm very much looking at ways to watch animals repeatedly over time. And sometimes that's not possible in wild systems, even in urban systems, especially with coyotes, which have the nickname Ghost of the Plains. So we combine captive work. So the photo that you see on the left is a photo of coyote pups at the captive coyote facility in Millville, Utah. It's a USDA facility that allows us to watch behavior of these animals over a long period of time. So for instance, I've watched these cute fluff balls turn into adults and watched them behave as adults and parents themselves, to using camera traps, which you see in the photo in the top right corner, to, of course, using collaring techniques and seeing how animals move across the landscape. The essentially comprehensive way in which we're understanding behavior of these animals, laying over GIS layers of different societal factors, helps us to understand how these animals are behaving in cities and around people. Next slide. So with that, I'd like to just briefly thank all of my collaborators that have been a part of the research. I certainly will hold for any questions in the future about how we understand both social and natural dynamics and these feedbacks in order to essentially create tailor-made solutions and tools that are based in evolution, that are based in behavior, to help mitigate conflict as cities continue to grow. Thank you.
Hi, okay, thanks, Chris. And thanks, Rebecca, for just pulling this together today. So I'm Heather Johnson, and my experience to bring to this discussion today comes primarily from conducting research on both the ecological side and the social side of drivers affecting human black bear conflicts, and it's work I've done for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And kind of my bias in coming into this work and thinking about conflicts and carnivore-human coexistence. I mean, I come to it totally from a wildlife ecology background. And when I started, I was kind of tasked by Colorado Parks and Wildlife to really understand why human bear conflicts were increasing. I really tackled it initially from just that wildlife side, really studying the bears. And it became really clear early on that I was going to have to also think about studying people, which I was pretty ill-equipped to do. So, fortunately, we've got a team together to help do that. But real quick, I'm going to use the we a lot today instead of the I, and we is a lot of folks that helped with this, but I want to particularly acknowledge Stuart Breck, Dave Lewis, Lyle Wilmarth, and Stacy Lishka. Okay, slide, Rebecca. Okay, and so the system I want to talk about today in terms of human-carnivore interactions is the work we did around Durango, which is in the southwest part of Colorado. Durango consists of about 20,000 residents. So it's a smaller city, you know, like Chris was talking about, and much more urban system. You know, this is kind of, you know, a smaller city, really typical of mountain towns in Colorado and a lot of places in the Western US, where you might have some kind of urban core, but a lot of it is residential housing development. You have, you know, and then kind of ex-urban and rural development as you get further out. And, you know, like a lot of mountain towns in the West, Durango has this really abrupt urban wildland interface. And it's a town that's surrounded by just amazing wildlife habitat, amazing bear habitat. And so as you see the inset picture there, it's a town that has where people have a lot of interactions with bears. In the surveys we sent out, you know, we asked people about their interactions with bears, and 70% of the residents here reported having a negative interaction with a bear, at least one within the last couple of years. So, I mean, this is a place where everyone in Durango has a bear story. Okay. And the interactions that people have with bears around Durango look a lot like this. You know, lots of bears in trash, bears and bird feeders, bears getting into people's pet food that's left outside and their fruit trees. And then, you know, also going to the more extremes where bears are breaking into garages, cars, houses, and in the most extreme example, you know, having, you know, charging folks. We've had a couple of attacks during the years where we were doing this study. So given kind of, you know, this situation, go ahead, Rebecca, next slide. We wanted to really dig into these questions. You know, really understand first, why were human-bear conflicts increasing so much in this system? Is this because bears are just changing their behavior, you know, in these systems, or are there more bears? You know, and figuring out the difference between those two things really makes a big difference in terms of how you might try to manage the problem. Second, you know, how do human attitudes, and particularly how do human behaviors contribute to the problem? And then last, what management actions would be most effective at reducing conflicts? And so to get at those questions, we used, you know, lots of different methods, focused both on the bears and the people. On the bear side of things, we conducted just shy of 1,000 captures. You know, we marked bears, we collared them, we tracked females to their dens to look at body condition, reproductive success. We did lots of non-invasive genetic sampling to look at changes in bear abundance. We looked at changes in food availability for bears. On the human side of things, we sent out surveys every other year to understand what human perceptions were. We did a massive bear proofing experiment where we deployed over 1,100 bear resistant trash containers. And then we spied on people in the wee hours of the morning to see if they had locked their trash cans or whether they're following wildlife ordinances in Durango. And so through kind of using that host of tools, I'm gonna just summarize a couple key points, key findings. So go ahead, Rebecca, thanks. So first, you know, something we found is conflicts were increasing due to changes in bear behavior, not changes in bear abundance. And that was a big thing for us to understand. You know, bears increased use of development when natural foods were scarce. They stuck into town to really use human food as a source of subsidy. And then those bears that were using human food as a source of subsidy also reduced their hibernation time. So they're up more of the year, interacting with people for longer of the year. They also were up more of the year when the weather was warmer, winter temperatures were warmer. And we also saw that, you know, bears that used more development, they gained some benefits. They had more body fat, they were in better body condition, they had more cubs, but they also had reduced cub and adult survival. And as bears increased use of development, their population declined. So this kind of place where coexistence was happening, you know, in this kind of landscape, resulted in a population sink. A lot of our work has shown that, and the data that we collected have been really counter to common management assumptions. So for example, you know, this kind of idea that once a problem bear, always a problem bear, you know, we didn't see that. Instead, we saw, you know, bears would use human food, come into town, create all these conflicts when there really wasn't much natural food available. And then they'd switch back when there was. and that bears definitely perceive this risk foraging around human food. And if they didn't need to do it, they don't want to do it. And if the forage benefit wasn't there, they prefer to use human or natural foods when they're available. And we also saw that conflicts, again, weren't a function of bear abundance, but our conflicts actually increased as the number of bears in our system declined. And that, certainly counter to a lot of assumptions that, more conflicts must mean more bears. And the way to deal with that might be numerical. Okay, and then finally, what we found was that conflicts declined when people reduced human foods available to bears, that was a strategy that was effective. We found that bears were interacting with people and causing conflicts really to gain access to garbage. And we did this big bear proofing experiment and found that, when people really lock up their trash, 60% of folks on a block locked up their trash, then you could reduce conflict significantly. And that those, taking this kind of measure, you didn't just see the ecological benefits of bears, not wanting to forage around people, but you also saw these huge social benefits. And that the containers change public perceptions about management, positively, increased support for ordinances and reduce concerns about future risk. So lots of both ecological and social benefits. Okay. And then here, just last, in terms of thinking about the theme of this plenary in terms of coexistence, we kind of thought about, what does coexistence look like in our different systems? And from my perspective, in a system like Durango, this town is surrounded by great habitat. Coexistence will always have bears in the system. Bears will always be around Durango. They'll always move through the Durango, and that's going to continue. But hopefully, they won't seek out Durango so hard as a source of food subsidy and really see people and development as a key foraging area. That's what we want to try to kind of break that pattern. And coexistence would look, I think, just a place where you have a limited number of conflicts that are experienced by residents and reported to agencies, a tolerable number of conflicts on both of those standpoints. Few bears will be lethally removed. That's just such an unpopular management strategy from the public standpoint and from the agency standpoint. And finally, that you would have, coexistence would have a sustainable local bear population. And it was surprising to us to see how important this was to residents. 82% of residents from our surveys wanted the bear population to be stable or increasing. 84% felt it was important to know bears lived in their area and would continue to exist. So it was important for folks living here to know that the bears were there. Yet, as bears increased this use of development, it was also causing population to sink, and the magnitude of that really escalated when natural foods were scarce. So I think a lot of times we think about coexistence in terms of tolerance and in terms of reducing conflicts to be sort of a minimal level and still having carnivores in the landscape, but we don't maybe necessarily think about, are those carnivores self-sustaining? Is that population actually self-sustaining? So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Heather and Chris. Great talks. Again, my name is Seth Wilson. I'm currently the executive director of an NGO called the Blackfoot Challenge that has been around since 1993, and we are based in Western Montana, focused on community-based collaboration. We cover a host of different conservation and natural resource issues, from water, wildfire, to carnivores like grizzly bears and wolves. I just thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself, and I went through, schooling like much of us have, and had a PhD and went on and did a postdoc, and I've been really steeped in the school of practical, on the ground work as an applied conservation biologist. And I think when we deal with carnivores, humility is a really important trait to have. And I've always felt that being an expert learner versus being a so-called expert has served me well. As we've already seen so far this morning, we're dealing with issues of animal behavior, population biology, social and cultural norms. And so I find that being willing to learn and adapt as I've worked on these issues for the last 15 to 20 years has been very well, has served me very well. I also consider myself a pragmatic idealist. I really came out of school with, that incredible passion for science to serve conservation biology. But I quickly learned in a place like Montana that one might need to be very practical and use a lot of common sense strategies. And you can see a picture here. We've got domestic compost. You might be wondering what this is. Well, I go through school, you get a PhD, and one of the projects I'll briefly talk about today is we remove livestock carcasses that otherwise attract wolves and bears onto Montana ranches, and we had to figure out how to dispose of them. And so I learned how to, compost livestock carcasses as part of my practical approach to conserving bears and wolves. And I've done this, as I said earlier, with very much an applied approach to my work. Next slide. So I work primarily, I'm just back from working in Europe for 3 years on a Eurasian lynx translocation effort. But prior to that, I worked in Western Montana in an ecosystem we call the crown of the continent. It's about 10 million acres. Got an incredible array of Native American reservations, glacier and Waterton National Park. We've got the Great Bear Wilderness, Bob Marshall Wilderness, and the Scapegoat Wilderness. I worked in the Blackfoot watershed, which is about 1.5 million acres at the very southern end of this large wild area. I work in a place that's largely in agriculture, small to mid-sized ranching operations. These are called cow-calf ranching operations. We've got some forestry and some recreation. The important point to just take home from this slide is that we've got multiple ownerships. We've got a large portion of valley bottom in private land, and we've worked collaboratively across this landscape with both state, federal agencies, and many private landowners. Okay, next slide. We've been primarily dealing with grizzly bears and gray wolves. Grizzly bears began reestablishing themselves on these private agricultural lands beginning in the early 2000s. Gray wolves recolonized this valley. We were one of the last large valleys in Montana, in western Montana, to be recolonized by gray wolves in 2007. So we primarily focused on these two species. Grizzly bears are still a listed species, which affords them protection under the Endangered Species Act, and gray wolves are currently managed by the state of Montana, are both hunted and trapped, and there's fairly aggressive management when wolves depredate on livestock, and that's a part of our focus, is to try to minimize the chances of wolves killing livestock. So these are our two species we've focused on mainly over the last 15 years. Next slide. So one of our main efforts, and I come back to this idea of being pragmatic, we felt that it was smart to focus on changing practices, land use practices and human behaviors versus a full sort of frontal assault on people's attitudes and perceptions. And so, again, we took a very practical approach, and we focused beginning in the early 2000s with our grizzly bear work with sort of three main goals: to protect human safety, maintain rural livelihoods, and prevent or reduce conflicts with grizzlies and wolves. And these are, by design, very anthropocentrically focused. And we felt that this was a smart way to bridge that cultural divide between conservation biologists and the rural ranching community. And you can see this language is focused on sort of management and control. And we used sort of non-threatening language when we got our early start with talking about grizzly bears and wolves. And we certainly didn't talk about connectivity and building connections between, say, Yellowstone and the Yukon. And so while all of those are part of my idealistic goals as a conservation biologist, again, coming back to this practical piece, we wanted to maintain livelihoods and protect human safety so that we could coexist with bears and wolves in this working landscape. Next slide, Rebecca. And for me, what coexistence has meant here over the last 15 years to actually achieve some semblance of coexistence, I think the heart of our work has been based on rational communication and building non-threatening ways to discuss these issues, to bring science and good decision-making into our process. And so I've really been honored to work with a ranching community that's been willing to meet regularly and build trust through participatory projects. We've involved ranchers in counting wolves. We've involved ranchers in GIS mapping to identify hotspots for conflict amelioration, and that has been a very powerful approach, building trust through participation. And finally, I think another kind of bedrock part of our work is that we've really worked hard to include communities of place, people who live here, and communities of interest. We work closely with larger national NGOs, the Nature Conservancy, Defenders of Wildlife, and it's that balancing or managing those values where the broad public interest can be served, I believe gets us, again, to changing practices in human behaviors. And the slides, the photos at the very bottom are just a few examples of some of the work we've done. As I mentioned, we remove about 500 livestock carcasses off of about 120 ranches and compost those that otherwise would be left on a ranch, and this is due to natural death loss, but that draws bears and wolves into conflict situations. We've developed portable fladry systems with ranchers. In the center photo, we use electric fencing. We've put about 90,000 linear feet of electric fences onto more than 20 ranches on calving areas to protect calves. We do, as Heather mentioned, a lot of sanitation to keep bears out of human garbage and transfer sites. And we also have a range rider program where we monitor wolves and livestock. And these are just a few examples of some of the work, again, getting to those practices where I think you can achieve benefits for people and carnivores. All of this has helped reduce conflicts with bears from 2003 to 2015. We reduced conflicts by 75% with grizzly bears. And today with wolves, we have less than 3 wolves killed for livestock depredations per year. So we have about 8 to 10 wolf packs, some 50 to 60 wolves in the watershed. And so that's where I'll stop and pass it over to Kyle. So, thank you.
Hi, thank you, Seth, and Heather, and Chris, and Rebecca. So my name's Kyle Artel. I'm an adjunct at UVic and a research associate with Rain Coast Conservation Foundation. Next slide, please. I'm based in oh yeah, and I've animated this heavily, so sorry in advance for the coordination here. I'm based in Waigilisla or Bella Bella in Haithtauk or Heiltsuk territory on the central coast of British Columbia, in an area now known as the Great Bear Rainforest. I'm part of a large research and stewardship collaboration involving NGOs, universities, and led by the Central Coast First Nations, whose territories comprise the whole Central Coast region. Can you just click a few times here, please? There should be 4 logos, it'll pop up. And so the nations involved in this, the Central Coast nations, are from the top left and moving clockwise, Nukhalk, Haithtauk, Wiikanuch, and Kitasoo nations. Next slide, please. Our work encompasses a lot of species, but I'll focus today on black and grizzly bears. And so in thinking about coexistence here, it's helpful context to note that for the nations here, grizzly bears are not just a species of conservation importance, but they're also relatives. And this is discussed in a great paper led by Duquoisla William Housty that's on the screen here. So in line with that, coexistence here goes beyond just minimizing harm through minimizing conflicts, although that's important. And actually click a few times, please, to also supporting other aspects of well-being. And so I'll share just a few examples of some of the work our collaboration does to that end. Next slide, please. I'll start off with an example of understanding conflict itself, of direct conflict. And you've kind of heard this story already. This is very parallel, actually, to the work that Heather's done. But in this case, we looked across British Columbia, and we wanted to understand what explains the patterns in bear-human conflict. Why some years there's a lot of bear-human conflict, and other years there's relatively little. And so first, again, we tested a fairly common assumption in this case, that if you increase mortality on bears to reduce their population, that conflict should go down. And again, across 35 years of data, we found no evidence to support that. But what we did find was, and again, parallel to Heather's work, a strong association with yearly food availability, in this case with salmon. So as salmon availability went down in a given year, conflicts went up. However, in BC, salmon and bears are managed by different agencies at the federal and provincial level. So the colonial governments manage these separately. By contrast, across nations in this area, these two species are managed together, often by the same people, or at least in the same department. And so there's some really exciting on-the-ground stewardship happening in this area that addresses this connection, including NACCB work that Jason will be speaking about in just a moment. Okay, so another aspect of work here looks at additional needs of bears to inform policies that support coexistence through this aspect of their well-being, through ensuring that they have sufficient food. So there's quite a bit of research that's come out of this collaboration on the links between salmon and bears, and here's just a small sampling of this. I encourage, if folks are interested, to go to the Applied Conservation Sciences Lab website, to the Raincoast website, or to the websites of any of the individual nations to learn about some of this work happening. So lots of work sort of studying this link, and there's a lot of work on the ground led by nations again to steward salmon and that link, an important link with bears, and that important link for the well-being of bears. Next slide, please. Another aspect of the work involved here is looking at habitat needs. Another aspect of well-being is to ensure that bears have homes. So for example, research is ongoing on the protected areas network in the region, and to make sure that it sufficiently protects high-value bear habitats, and work on modifying forestry, where nations are pushing forward policies that go above and beyond provincial policies to again safeguard bears and to modify forestry in order to safeguard bears. A few more clicks here, please. And then there's finally some really interesting work developing here on ecotourism. So the ecotourism industry is praised as a more sustainable alternative to extractive industries like bear hunting. But nations want to ensure that this industry can coexist with bears in a way that doesn't lead to potential harm through, for example, causing stresses, pushing them away from food areas, etc. So in two separate projects, the Kirisou and Nuxalk nations are doing some experimental and observational research to assess the effects of ecotourism on bears. And the results from this research will inform refinements to adaptive evidence-based tourism policies set by the nations. So this is just a sampling of the work happening in this area. I'd encourage people to Google to learn more about this, about Indigenous-led governance initiatives throughout the area. And just a final thought about what's happening in this system, and what coexistence looks like here. The nations leading this collaboration and stewardship here have coexisted with carnivores for millennia. So they know how to do it. And in addition to that, they have the right to do it, to govern their own territories and steward the species within them. So on the coast here, decolonization is ongoing. It's a process, but this is a really nice example, in my mind, a bit of a bright spot of conservation benefits for bears arising out of and in concert with a resurgence of Indigenous-led governance and recognition of inherent rights. So an example here of conservation very much pairing with social justice. And so with that, I'll stop talking so you can hear from a key leader in this region, someone who's been crucial in pushing the needle forward on human-carnivore coexistence, Jane Moody.
Thank you, Kyle. It's a big thing here. Thank you for the time to talk here about our experiences here in the traditional Nuxalk territory. My name is Jason Moody. I'm the Fisheries and Wildlife Program Coordinator for the Nucalk Stewardship Office in traditional Nucalk territory and Bella Coola, British Columbia, Canada. I've been asked by Kyle to speak on the project that we run here in Bella Coola. Next slide, please. As you can see here in the slide, it's our estuary leading out the channel to open sea, and our old village site to the right, and our recent village there to the left. We also have another village site further upstream, about 4 miles. The Bear Safety Project was initiated by our Stewardship Office in 2014, and this was to help the community with attractants. We could see less salmon, and the bears were now looking for any food sources, especially salmon that we had harvested and we had at home, or game, fruit, and garbage. Next slide, please. They were walking through our town sites, in the streets, alleys, in our yards, and we could see an imbalance in the environment. It was affecting the bears and thus impacting us like we had never seen before. Salmon protection on all fronts is key, but also controlling our public and personal spaces was essential for the bears and ourselves. As Kyle mentioned, with less salmon, there's more conflicts, and we definitely saw this. And this was a turning point for our fisheries office. After that, we became the Fisheries and Wildlife Office. Next slide. You can see in the next slide that there's some e-fencing and fruit fishing that's going on. They're very linked together. And we knew the only way to understand bears, here in Bella Coola anyway, is to study and protect the salmon as well. Key elements of the Bear Safety Project include working with the people to control their attractants, using electric fencing, composting or designated dumping sites, and performing annual brushing in both our town sites. Working with the people is essential, as well as other government representatives, such as the Conservation Officer Service, Ministry of Environment, Fisheries and Oceans, and WildSafe BC. Nucalk, we have a deep history with the bears since our beginnings, and we have a responsibility to be there for them as stewards of our traditional territory. They are in our creation stories, our songs, and have always played a role of peacekeeper and bringer of justice. Bears have actually never been a villain in our history. And this project is a tip of the iceberg, so to speak, and has connections to other work such as the Nucalk Spring, Summer, and Fall Bear Studies, and our new one, the Bear Behavioral Study. And this is to do with the ecotourism and wildlife viewing. In the future, we plan to expand bear safety to include more components to help with coexistence in the Bella Coola Valley. Next slide, please. As this valley is a conflict hotspot, as you can see in this picture, it's about an 80-kilometer valley with properties all the way through it. As a hotspot, many bears can be saved here every year. When we see the opportunity to positively influence a trophy hunting mentality, we focus on that situation. This is with the understanding that this individual can help change many other people's views as well. It requires our staff to be ready to provide without pushing too hard on the big issues, and keeping it simple and showing support. That's the main point. As trust grows, working in the field, people become more open to things as electric fencing and general cleanup and maintenance of their properties. Slowly, we're seeing the guns being put away and a shift to new methods coming to the forefront. This has come from our staff working in the field and gaining support from the ground up, as change must come from the people, not just from an office telling them what to do. Thank you very much for including us in this conversation today, and I look forward to sharing more about our story with the bears. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much to all the speakers. That was a fabulous overview and introduction of your work. And I would like you now all to please unmute yourselves, or at least turn your videos on. So, you know, in preparing for this conversation and for this plenary, we've already had a chance as a group to discuss some of the issues that really came out of thinking about similarities and differences we're seeing across this really diverse set of systems and diverse set of questions that you all have looked at. And so one piece that we wanted to bring back together as a group is to talk a little bit about what you see as some of the biggest similarities and the biggest differences in human-predator coexistence issues across this gradient. So where do we see some of those similarities, and where do we really have to tailor things to totally different densities of human population or different issues that are on the ground? And for all these, I'll just, I think probably the easiest is for you just to kind of, you know, raise your hand, and then I'll just call on you just so we're not talking over each other too much. Okay, go ahead, Heather.
I mean, yeah, I think to me what's striking, well, certainly we all talk about human behavior change at some level. I mean, that seems like pretty ubiquitous across systems, that it comes down to, you know, there's most things we're not going to do much to change what the animals are doing, but yeah, the human behavior change thing piece and how important that is, and probably how ill-equipped most of us are to really think about that and know how to do it super effectively. And then I also, because it's been fun for me too to kind of listen to people talk about, you know, just their systems and how different they are. But despite how different our systems are, I mean, it seems like no matter what, I mean, it's these carnivores are largely, you know, using some sort of food subsidy, right, from our systems, whether it's in the city with cats and coyotes, or, you know, garbage, or, you know, in the Blackfoot, you know, like coming in for, you know, carcass piles, or, you know, that these conflicts are largely, you know, really around these food sources and trying to minimize that, you know, across the diversity of sources. But yeah.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I was just going to build off of what Heather said, and thinking about human behavior is really important in terms of us not separating ourselves from the system, but that we are integral to the system, and understanding how integral that is and in what way. It may vary from, say, site to site on this urban-rural gradient, but we are a large part of it. So it's funny, I think a lot of us were probably traditionally trained as wildlife ecologists, but we do most of our work with the people, which is, as Heather said, right? Like we weren't traditionally equipped to do that, but that's also part of the reason why it's so important to collaborate with social scientists and build those collaborations, and to collaborate with sovereign nations, and to collaborate with communities of color, because the human element is superbly important.
Absolutely, I would echo that too, Chris. I just wanted to comment on Kyle and Jason's work. First off, fantastic work, both of you. It just was so striking to me to think about one of you know, how we use language, and you talked about the bear safety project. And that would be, for me, if I started off conversations in my ecosystem with, it's all about bear safety, it would be a real non-starter in some ways, because I'm dealing with a much sort of different kind of cultural context. And so just an observation that the similarities we've talked about, this changes in human behaviors, and it's really that how do we change human behaviors in these different contexts, whether it's a more regulatory approach or these long-term relationship buildings. And as much as our systems are different, Kyle and Jason, I was really struck also by how similar they are, that for us, it's about building trust through participatory projects, and it's taken us decades to build that trust, to actually get those changes in behaviors by rural ranchers. But it's been worth it, and it's a long journey, but certainly worthwhile endeavor.
Maybe can I quote you, Jay, to speak to that? One of my favorite quotes of Jay's on that piece is that someone in the community came up to him and said, "Thank you so much for running this bear safe program. Thank you for keeping us safe from the bears." And Jay's response was, "No, it's the bear safe program. We're keeping the bears safe from you." And to me, I love that quote, because it just really, I think Chris said at the beginning how we think about conflicts really then, or how we think about coexistence really guides how we act. And I think that sort of really crystallized how you're looking at this situation, and how that's sort of informed the incredible work you're doing. So I love that quote.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, people's lives are so complex, and it's really hard to change things once they've been doing them for a long time. And the bears are just consistent. They just do their thing, and you know what they're doing, right? And it's just, there's so many things that are related, especially to your work, Heather, where everybody comes out with these statements that there's so many bears. And my response is always, well, there couldn't be. We studied, know how many bears actually been here and come out of this area, but it's a concentration of bears looking for food. So there's just more conflicts with less food. And so I'm always trying to kind of get them on track with what's the truth. That's what we always say too, is let's find out the truth. That's one of our main goals too. So people can get together and talk about things behind closed doors, and it just goes from there, but they need to get involved and understand what is actually happening out there. Yeah.
Great. So another piece that, I think we discussed a lot, and that's really come out of your conversations and your presentations today, is looking at human behavior change and kind of the different cultures that you're working in. And so, one question is how you view human behavior change in relation to predator coexistence. One of the things we've talked about is top-down versus bottom-up strategies. Heather mentioned having more ordinances for garbage cans, for example. And from what I heard from Jay was more of, really getting the buy-in from the community and from Seth. And then Heather, it seems like that maybe came later once you actually impose stuff. And so how do those different strategies, which one is most effective, or how do they work together to help with human behavior change and human buy-in to the kinds of actions that you're working towards? And to what extent do you view predator coexistence as managing people versus managing a predator population?
I guess maybe I'll start. Folks can jump in, but yeah, it's all about the people, right? People management. It's all about people management, and certainly people, I think, in agencies that, wildlife agencies that have to manage this problem would say that you know, pretty much 100%. You know, it's because one of the things, well, I tend to work in bigger places, you know, 20,000 people in Durango, or we've thought about conflicts in lots of other places in Colorado where you have 100,000 people, all kinds of communities on the Front Range and stuff. Just a lot of people. I live in Anchorage right now, 300,000 people. We have all kinds of bear conflicts. You really deal with it like bottom-up solution, you know, like working with people one-on-one in a city of 300,000, 100,000, 50,000, 20,000. You know, and when these bigger places, I tend to kind of think it takes kind of like maybe some top-down, like, you know, just institutional changes in how I do things. Because I think, you know, what I hear a lot of from folks like on the trash issue, it's like, well, I'm not going to buy a bear can until a bear gets to my trash. Or maybe it's going to take a bear getting into my trash can a few times before I'll maybe get a bear resistant trash container. And it's like, if it's going to take everyone to do that, you know, everyone has to have that personal experience of a bear getting in a garbage can before you'll take an action. Like that is a lot of food conditioned bears and a lot of dead bears. You know, that we don't have time for that, you know. So it is interesting to think about how context shapes this, and at what point, you know, do you maybe have to think about transitioning, like where does bottom up work, and maybe where might it have to transition to a top down approach? But I'm super interested to hear what other people think about that.
Go ahead and jump in, or if somebody raised their hand, I'm sorry, I missed it.
Sure. Yeah, I'll jump in. I think that's, I feel like it has to be tailor made to the solution, right? Because certainly depending on the people you're working with, sometimes bottom up works better for top down. And that may be in a larger city with, you know, more than 300,000 people. Certainly trying to do bottom up takes a lot of work, and both actually do. So if we're thinking about creating policy from the top down, that likely takes a lot of data collection, then reporting on that data, then getting involved with folks that are actually making the policies at the municipal level, at least in the city, versus bottom up is talking to different people, maybe having informational sessions, but it doesn't always connect to everybody. So, you know, one of the biggest problems I have is how to connect with specific communities, make sure that people aren't left out. So certain communities, say for instance, have greater flexibility in being able to, say, attend an informational session on coyotes. I noticed that a lot actually in the work that I've done, not just here in kind of the Pacific Northwest, but also in Chicago, also in the Fort Collins, Denver area, is that normally when we would ever have informational sessions to try and change human behavior, most of the time the people that came to those sessions were older, were whiter, we're wealthier. So how we connect with different communities may mean that we have to do a mix of both. So maybe, for instance, folks that are more kind of intransigent at, say, keeping their cat indoors or keeping locks on their trash cans or not feeding wildlife, creating laws or policies or penalties that guard against that, versus, say, talking with folks about just like the importance of wildlife in their neighborhoods and why they're important. Some may be more receptive to hearing that than others. And as kind of like Jason talked about, that goes with the complexity of people's experiences. So their experiences with the organisms in question, but just also their views on land is really important as well. It should be noted that we've been making a lot of land acknowledgements. We also have realized in cities in general, people that have greater wealth also feel like they have greater ownership of the land, like as if they own the land, and therefore by virtue of owning the land, they feel like they own the organisms on that land, so they can make whatever call they decide they want to make. That is really hard to fight against.
Yeah, I guess you've got a much different social setting with a really highly populated place versus really a wild area still here in Bella Coola. But you do have private properties. You have the Wildlife Act, which is very limited and not designed by First Nations. It has no input. And then you have First Nations reserves. And so a very different type of system where people are confined to, and it's such a different system. So And then you have the stewardship office, which is actually designed to work in the full territory and off reserve with traditional laws involving hereditary chiefs, elders, knowledge holders. So if you want to make law, it's not just the same as a municipality. You actually have to hold a traditional feast or a gathering, and then actually involve the people involved. And everybody can speak from their different families. So it's a different, it's just an older ancient system that we work with. So it has to involve the people. But we still want to expand into private properties and work with those homeowners. They're asking us to do that now. So we're actually looking at each private property, working with that homeowner, creating a relationship, and actually inserting a clause into the deed saying any future residents on this property have to acknowledge they're in a corridor or on a salmon stream and need to work with the First Nation that you're residing in and follow all these things that we've done and that work. So as we can start to change that behavior, more people will get on board. So it's just a little bit different, the situation. Yeah.
Go ahead, Seth.
Yeah, great conversation. I would just say, in our experience, having the Endangered Species Act was, I think, really vital. It provided this legal backdrop for the protection of grizzly bears. It still does. And, contrary to some of folks that are sort of the naysayers that don't like regulation, I think having that regulatory legal framework where there are repercussions for the unlawful killing of bears really fostered creativity that helped get us to coexistence. And so I think we have to have both. And I also think within any context, we talk about focal species. I think within any context or system, we focused on focal people. And so who are some of those leaders who can bring a community along, whether it's a mayor of a city to help, encourage acceptance of ordinances and so forth. But, in Montana, some of these traditional, long-time, multi-generational families have a lot of respect and that peer-to-peer messaging that can emanate and sort of diffuse a positive message about how to live with bears through practical means. That's been useful for us, this idea of sort of focal people with leadership capacity.
Great. I think for now we might cycle back to one more question, but I'd like to move to some of the audience questions. We'll see how many we can get to. There's quite a few coming in. One of the first ones that kind of dovetails nicely with what you've been talking about is interesting. What social science or interdisciplinary training did you actually receive in your academic careers as ecologists? And what would you recommend today, knowing what you know? Go ahead, Seth.
I could just jump in. I think I really benefited from coming into the arena of carnivores from an undergraduate degree in political science and environmental studies. And then I went and got a master's degree in environmental studies and finally a PhD in forestry. And it was hard work to swim upstream coming from the humanities into the harder sciences. And I reckon for me, it was excellent to have both and have that training in the hard sciences, but it was a harder path that for me to take, but really has served me well in the long run, having that both that social science and the harder ecology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for me, I started out as a psychology major, which doesn't necessarily fall under the umbrella of social sciences, but was a psychology major in undergrad and did a lot of work more so in the biology, biomedical sciences before eventually coming to my now appointment at University of Washington, Tacoma, where I'm in the room oftentimes in a division in a department that I sit next to somebody who teaches theater studies, and then somebody who teaches political science, and then across the way somebody who teaches law and wrongful imprisonment. So I very often am in the room with people that are thinking about people in many different sectors of life, and have conversations that probably aren't normal conversations that folks in a traditional biology department would have. So how, for instance, different rates of, say, like eviction and displacement influence the way in which people interact with wildlife, how access to green space influences who feels the benefits of these environmental amenities. Conversations that I think during my academic upbringing, they were never being had, but that paired with, say, just my overall personal experience of being Black in America helped me to then meld all of them together. So certainly always constantly learning. I think Seth put it out very well, of being kind of a scholarly learner, an expert learner, and very much I like to embody that as well.
As that being like a pretty traditional wildlife background, I had almost no training on the social science side. And when we entered this project where we were trying to really understand both bears and people, that became super obvious. And we partnered with social scientists from Colorado State University and a PhD student, social scientists involved with the study. But for us, to be honest, it was really hard. We didn't speak the same language. We used different, data types. We think about analyzing data differently. We try to think about how do we integrate the ecological and the social data, and we really struggled with that. You can see some publications where we've tried to do that, but we've really struggled with how to do that well, and how to tie in the social science with the ecological science, and for them being like really good examples, I think, to draw from on how to do that. I just don't think there's really great examples of that. And it was not an easy collaboration for us at all.
I guess my training has been more on the quantitative side for sure, but I've found it really helpful to have collaborations with folks who do have the social science training. I think that can be wonderful. If you don't have both, just having both those levels of training, to have people on the team who have both, although I guess there's maybe some translational issues. But I'd also think that thinking about, when we think about interdisciplinary, it's still often within the Western academy, or right, academia. I think there's a lot of value in going beyond that as well to other knowledge systems. And so that's, I've found really enriching too, when you have collaborations that cross not just disciplines, but cross knowledge systems, is, I think, a really great avenue, especially for something like what we're talking about today, where then suddenly you get this really broad diversity of perspectives, and get a much richer insight and applications and whatnot.
Yeah. I spent quite a bit of time in university, and I majored in geography, anthropology as well. But what I found that I got back home from classes every summer, that's where I learned so much about our territory, really started to understand the salmon and understand the bears. And I started in fisheries very young, at I think 16, when I started working for DFO. And I continued right up till my mid-20s. And so I took that knowledge to the Moorcock Fisheries program after that, and started as a river guardian. And we just worked with salmon at that time. And as the numbers really started, salmon started to decrease, we saw all these other things happening. And actually got to work with my sister, Megan Moody. She was the director of the stewardship office at that time. And we had to devise plans to adapt to this changing climate and decreasing salmon. And So we changed our fisheries office to include wildlife as well, and started doing bear studies and started doing the bear safety project to address all the issues and all the phone calls coming in from people that needed help. And that's where things really took off, was understanding everything, because it has to do with the habitat, the old ancient systems. The water is so important. And then all the wildlife and the bears, how they're all connected, and how it all influences us in the end. So when people ask us, why are you guys doing so much work with bears? Why are you studying so much about bears? And like, because they're connected to us. It's a part of a system, an ancient system that we're involved in. There's no changing that. There's a real move for our people to return to these ancient village sites and use them, but can they even support us now? If there's too much deforestation or damage done to the water systems and food systems there, studying bears in that area will show that right away. And then also, why are so many bears coming here at a certain time of the year? Well, you can see that there's a lot less food in all the other watersheds surrounding the valley, because they've got this state-of-the-art facility, Snoodley Creek Hatchery, which just puts out so much chum, salmon, like fry every spring. So you have this enhanced system where all the bears come to. And we study these other areas, and there's not much activity. So we're dealing with a really big imbalance within our territory that we're starting to really work on, to make sure that we don't forget about all these other areas that are home to all these other animals, especially too, if we want to return to those areas. So salmon protection has always been a big part of it, as well as the habitat.
Great. I've got a couple questions that are more specific to individual talks that we can hopefully address. One for Chris. What are some practices you believe can help reduce human-coyote conflicts in urban areas? And kind of how does that relate to the tolerance and awareness gradient that you described?
Yeah, I think the first thing that always comes to mind to me is don't feed wildlife, right? That's a really big piece of that. And being very mindful about where you have, say, refuse, where there may be particular hotspots of where animals are getting food. I had shown a photo of a coyote with a pizza slice in its mouth. It's a very famous coyote in Huntington Beach that would be fed a slice of pizza like almost every other week. Showed some photos from, Point Defiance Park in Tacoma. This happens frequently, even when we put up signs that say, don't feed wildlife. And back to Heather's point from earlier, it's really hard when we say, okay, well, if a resident says, we'll stop or we'll get a trash can that can be locked whenever we have a bear that has conflict. Here's the biggest piece of this. You guys may have recently heard that there was an attack, a coyote attack on a child in Chicago, the north side of Chicago. It was expected or suspected that coyote was being fed by residents. So say, for instance, if an animal is being hand-fed or supplemented any anthropogenic foods in one area, but the other area is doing a great job, it very much jeopardizes everybody's public health because of the fact that we're working on animals that don't see these barriers, right? They don't see barriers to neighborhoods. They don't see barriers to states. They don't pay attention to that. They're just moving across the landscape according to their own life history traits. So food is number one. Obviously, cats is number two for a whole host of reasons, especially on the West Coast. The amount of conflicts between, say, coyotes and cats is really high. I have collaborators in Los Angeles that have shown that certain populations of coyotes have about 25% of their diet represented as domestic cats. And apparently cats are now devising different behavioral strategies to ward off coyotes. So for sure, those that don't even work on carnivores know that cats are a problem and are an issue. And those are always the two biggest. It's like kind of tamping down on food subsidies and having cats stay indoors oftentimes mitigates a lot of the conflicts in cities.
And a question for Seth, asking about the use of guardian dogs to reduce carnivore conflict on ranches in the Northern Rockies. Is that something that you have used in Blackfoot Challenge? And how does it compare to other methods?
Yeah, our system is largely cattle, so we have very few sheep, and livestock guardian dogs have been used for millennia with sheep. I've had some limited experience experimenting with some Turkish breeds, Kangals and Akbash. We've done some limited testing with guard dogs on cattle. And that's sort of, I would say, emerging. There's some folks at Utah State who are looking at that as well. Some of the questions are how many guard dogs are effective with, say, wolves? Do you have to sort of create a sort of de facto guardian dog pack that would then, you know, deter wolves from depredating on cattle? So those are some of the questions that are emerging. They're very effective. Yeah, they've been used most generally with sheep, and in our system, we haven't had that much experience with them at this stage.
Great. And a question, a couple related questions for Heather. So a question about exactly why or if you know why the population is declining, the population of bears is declining, and if it's related to natural foods. Is that something that can be helped in the future? And like, why do conflicts increase when bear populations decline?
Yeah. Thanks for those questions. Sorry, I had to whip through so much information so quick, but all that stuff is also published, so please contact me and I can help you find resources. But generally, we had this kind of situation is food failures are becoming, natural food failures are becoming seemingly more frequent in Colorado and elsewhere in our system, where you just, in this case, you have like a hard late freeze with more climate variability, like a hard late freeze that kills off berry in nut production later in the summer, and combined with drought conditions and these things that are just creating more variable conditions, like in terms of natural food conditions for bears, at least in our system. And when you have this kind of natural food failures, we're having bears come into human development to find human foods as a source of subsidy. So that's driving up the conflicts. At the same time, town is a dangerous place for a bear to be. They get hit by cars, they get lethally removed. There's accidents, cubs climb up and get electrocuted in power poles, kind of all these things. So it's bears coming into town, seeking out those food subsidies, and then dying at a much higher rate that's associated with that population sink. And what's interesting, I think, is that bears and all these carnivores are changing their behavior. I mean, they are adapting. They're becoming more nocturnal. You know, they're changing their activity patterns. They're totally changing their behaviors. And they seem to often recognize risk associated with people, these landscapes of coexistence. They're also recognizing risk, and they're also seemingly trying to mitigate their risk in a lot of cases, but not quite successfully to ward off the demographic consequences of that coexistence. And so I think that's the real challenge. These animals are adapting. Behaviorally, they're adapting, but it's not quick enough to keep up with the demographic consequences.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So it is noon, and I know there are some lunch meetings happening today, and I want to acknowledge that. For those of you who can stay on, I just wanted to finish up with kind of one concluding question and thought from everybody before we break. And that is to kind of ask you where you think your work and that of your colleagues and your networks leaves us moving forward. You know, we had a question come in about, are we just fighting a losing battle? Is this something, do you see optimism? Do you see progress with ongoing threats like climate change and continuing urban encroachment in thinking about how we move forward as a human and natural society? Where do we go next in maintaining, restoring, and protecting diverse landscapes where predators and human communities can thrive?
I'll start since I was on the other end of the urban-rural spectrum. Certainly, we have an opportunity to create smarter, more wildlife-friendly, equitable cities. We're certainly at a precipice right now with the COVID pandemic, which should be noted, right, started as a function of human-wildlife conflict and urbanization. Our proximity to different species and habitat destruction and loss created a greater chance for interactions that have essentially put us in the position we're in right now. So we have a really great fundamental opportunity to understand, like, what do we want our cities to look like after this, right, in this new normal, and how do we want to structure it so that way, number one, everybody has access to wildlife, but number two, wildlife, when they're coexisting with us, can legitimately coexist. And it's not like examples don't already exist in and outside of cities. Of course, everybody uses Singapore as an example and the urban smooth-coated otter, but there certainly are other examples as well. And this is global, right? So we could talk about conflicts that happen in cities or otherwise, just everywhere. And we're all trying to figure out ways to mitigate that. So that means that we're going to have everybody in the room, from those that are leaders in their communities, to those that are urban planners, to the scientists, to the politicians, to figure out, like, what does our new normal look like now that we have this fresh opportunity to create these equitable, smarter cities that then also leverage wildlife, because we're running out of time.
Very well said, Chris. I would just add that absolutely bringing people into that room where we can have those respectful, rational decision-making forums is essential. And that, to me, that's where we can bring science and action, and we can bring that together in non-threatening ways. And oftentimes those may be facilitated processes that I think have to be inclusive, that really serve the broad public interest. And I'm hopeful if we can do that in Montana, where there's a lot of division and polarization politically, but cross some of these ideological and cultural divides, I'm hopeful we can do it in our cities, in our rural, to our wild places. But it begins with, it really begins with those respectful conversations that lead to lasting conservation impacts.
And I just throw out that I'm an optimist, and I think that it's pretty neat that we are talking about carnivores and people coexisting, and that has been the shift in the conversation in recent years, and that we have the problem of large carnivores recovering on a lot of landscapes where this is becoming more of a challenge, so that's a great thing that carnivores are more common on landscapes. We have to move towards thinking about coexistence. Even our management agencies thinking about coexistence, and really thinking, now, how do we define it? And then how do we reach it? How do we get better at human behavior change mechanisms, to promote coexistence?
I'm an optimist. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jay. Okay, so I'm an optimist. I mean, hearing the great work that's happening just in this digital room really inspires me across these different systems. And there are these sort of bright spots, where it's really working well, and we're lucky in some ways to be at a time where those bright spots can be shared really well. We can learn about stuff happening from across the world and use that to inform what we're doing in place. So that's really inspiring. And I also find inspiring that some of the paradigms are just changing. Some of these long-held assumptions of our role with carnivores, our role with the environment in general, these kind of insular, sort of colonial Western ideas of how we interact with the world are being challenged, and we're discussing it, and there's discussions that are happening. And so I find that all really exciting. I think that there's ways that we can come to solutions that work for people, that work for places. We're getting there, and we can share them. So I'm super happy.
That's really well said, Kyle. Your papers, your work, everything, supporting what nations want to do. I'd like to quote Doug Niesloss, a good friend of mine. We've got a lot of work to do, and that's got to be your approach, right? There's a lot of people in our communities, and there's a lot of things to set up for them, and it's a deep history that we have with these animals and with our territories that is such a cultural and social stronghold for our people to continue into the future and coexist and have rich resources to keep you healthy and alive. And this is the way we are. It's just there's no giving up or anything. It's there for us to work on and to benefit from. So that's who we are as stewards of our traditional territory.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think we'll wrap this up. I'm really grateful for all of you for your participation in this new landscape. Thank you to the live stream world. I keep drifting over my head too, for all your thoughtful questions and comments. Those I think are also going to be available later, as will this whole plenary. I encourage you to reach out directly to our plenary panelists today if you have more follow-up questions that you would like to ask them. We could talk about this as any of our plenary topics and many of our other topics all day, all week, all year. I'm also an optimist. I love hearing your thoughts on this topic. This is not my personal area of research or work, but I appreciate this work and I appreciate thinking about it and thinking about how we live with all parts of biodiversity. So thank you very much. And we'll talk again soon.
That's good.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Been
Thanks,
great to
Rebecca.
visit with everyone.